When we left chapter 2 of Daniel, things couldn't have gone better. Daniel was exalted to the position of privilege and power in Babylon. He had interpreted the king's dream, and because of that, he was promoted to heights of glory and honor. And he was as happy as a cat in a dairy. Have you ever noticed, however, when success happens, danger is just around the corner. 9 years are going to pass between chapter 2 and chapter 3 of the book of Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar is going to do something that's going to totally upset the apple cart in Daniel's life, and also his 3 friends. The king, he's going to manufacture a golden image, and it's going to be a replica of himself. And it's going to be 90 feet high, and it's going to be 9 feet wide. And it's going to be glowing and sparkling, and you can see it in the sunshine for miles, and it's covered in pure gold. Then he made an edict, this king, and he commanded a national order that everybody had to bow down, and they had to worship this image. It happened on the plain of Dura. The Bible tells us there was a military parade square up there, just outside the city of Babylon. And it was there that the king made a dedication of this golden replica of himself, of this goofy image. And he summoned every government official to be in attendance for the dedication. And I'm talking about governors, prefects, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, educators, and all the other provincial officials. And there they were, all waiting instructions, staring at this 90-foot god on the plain. Where would the king get such an idea? Make an image of gold of himself in his likeness, and make everybody in the country bow down and pay homage? I think I know. I think he got it when you look back at chapter 2. 9 years ago, do you remember when Daniel interpreted to him a statue, and it was really a statue about history? And do you remember all those 5 metals with gold at the top, and that gold was his head? I think that went to his head. Daniel told him that his interpretation of that was that the God in heaven had blessed him with rule and blessed him with power, with strength and glory. And I think because of that, he got a bit conceited. And that's why he came up with this whole idea of a 90-foot image in gold, 9 feet wide, of himself, there in chapter 3. And the king, he proves it. He brings all the leaders in preparation for that wonderful grand dedication. Now comes verse 4. The king's herald, they yell out this proclamation: "O peoples and nations and men of every language, hear ye. As soon as you hear the sound of the orchestra and the music, you must fall down and you must worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." Now comes a threat. However, whoever does not fall down and worship what I just read, he's going to be immediately thrown into a blazing furnace. You know, if I heard that, that statement would get my attention. Would it get yours? Well, you know now what's going to come along here, because every Jew that's living in Babylon is now being put on the spot. Do you obey the king, or do you die? Living in Babylon at this time, there were 3 friends of Daniel's, They all boarded in the same rooming house, all four of them. Their names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Some astrologers from the Babylonian University science faculty, they came forward and they denounced these Jews. And they said to the king, "Your Honor, there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but they don't pay any attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods, nor do they worship your gold image." Well, they brought these three men before the king. He wanted to hear for himself, is this really true? Hearing their behavior, it was true. He became furious, and he was full of a rage. There stands three men. They've been led into captivity to a foreign country. They're suddenly summoned before the king, and this king has the feelings of a Joe Stalin and an Adolf Hitler, who could tear them limb from limb and turn their house into rubble. He is now commanding that you fall down and worship his golden image. Now remember, these men are Jewish. If they fell down and did what they were told, they'd be breaking the first two commandments that they worship of their God, Yahweh. He said you should have no other gods before you. That was the first commandment. The next one following in his tail, don't make unto me any graven image. No idols. You're not going to worship those. When does one disobey the law of the land? Peter said, we must obey God and not man. Acts 4:8. These three men, friends of Daniel, have got to now make a decision. The words of the king, they're still ringing in their ears. Worship the image or burn in the furnace. That's their choice. Now comes a beautiful speech. Verse 16. These three Jewish men, here's the reply to the king. O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve, he's able to save us, and he will rescue us from your hand. But, O king, even if he does not, we want you to know we will not serve your God or gods or worship the image of gold that you have just set up there in the plain. Do you believe what I just read? Have you ever seen such amazing faith? Having committed themselves to the God of Israel, what do you think God's going to do for them? Is he going to commit himself to them? You know, I'm not as bold as these men. I don't have the strength to stand and defy a king like I just heard these men do. I think I'm more like Peter. Do you remember in Matthew 26:69? He told Jesus that he would not desert him, and he wasn't going to let Jesus down no matter what. And yet, at the moment of testing, he even had to lie to a small little girl that he didn't even know Jesus. These three Jewish captives knew in their heart that somehow God wouldn't let them down. And even if they did, they were still going to believe in him. How do you think the king's going to respond? What will happen to these three men? Verse 19. Here comes your answer. And the answer is swift. And the answer is furious. The king's attitude towards them did not change. He ordered that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. slaves started throwing in more straw and more buckets of tar. Some of the strongest soldiers in the army, they were commanded to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and be thrown into the furnace. But the flames were so intense, the Bible says, that these soldiers who tied up the men, they were killed by the heat of the fire. These 3 men now, all firmly tied, standing in front, they were pushed right into the middle of that blazing furnace. Do you know what I find amazing about this story? God, He didn't take the fire away. He could have put it out. He could have had a rainstorm come over and blow that fire to no smoke. He didn't. These men were thrown right into the middle of that furnace. What was God's purpose in all that? Did you ever ask yourself that? Well, here comes an answer. Verse 24. The king, Nebuchadnezzar, he leaped to his feet. The Bible says, in amazement. And he asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men tied up and thrown into that fire? They replied, certainly, O king. He said, take a look. I see 4 men walking around in the fire. They're unbound. They're unharmed. And the 4th looks like the son of one of the gods. The flames didn't touch them. They only burnt the ropes that the king had used to bind them. The one that was walking around with them, do you think it was an angel? Do you know what I think it was? I think it was Jesus. I think Jesus visited that furnace 500 years before he was born in Bethlehem. God sent his son. And I think I know why. He wanted these men, these 3 guys, to experience his son, just like you did when you got saved. They experienced his protection. They saw his fellowship. They felt his comfort. And they also knew his safety because the flames didn't bother them. Have any of you listening to me out there, have you experienced that in your fiery ordeals? Are you able to see what God did here? Nebuchadnezzar and those looking on with him, they got to see what God could do with fire and not be burned. They watched 3 men who would uphold and be loosened and be set free. And they got to see somebody they had never seen before. Look closely at the chapter. God's desire is also to witness. And he uses you as the witness. When you go through a trial, God set you up so he could get the glory. That's the show that God put on here. This story now is going to, in my mind, get a little bit comical. It's not in the text. It's in verse 26. But I'm just going to pretend. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace, and he shouted. He shouted the 3 names of these men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. Come out. Come here. Come to me. I want to see you. Here's my humor. What if they said back to Nebuchadnezzar, and they didn't? Your Majesty, you come on in here where we are. Come and experience the flame. Wouldn't that have been a joke? They'd be fried like a piece of bacon. So what do they do? Verse 30. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they come out of the fire, and all of the king's men gathered around, and they just stared at them. They saw that the fire had not harmed them. Not a hair on their head was singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Nebuchadnezzar then uttered, "Praise be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants." And the king then promoted them. And they got what they didn't expect. The king knew that he had just experienced a God that he had never faced before. Look a little closer at the faith of these three men. Commitment today has become a very rare commodity. We tend to give in, and we find it easy to give up. Happens on our job, happens in our education, happens in our marriages, happens in our faith, it even happens in our governments. Many Christians believe that God primarily exists just for their benefit. He only exists to bless them. These three men in our story, they were not like that. They placed no such conditions on God. Deliverance or not, God to them was their master, and he was worth obeying, and that's all they did. Over against that, the king, he was even more intolerable against these men because they wouldn't obey him. To guarantee their execution, he ordered the furnace be heated maximum intensity to make sure they never would be seen again. When they were thrown in, the king knew that they had just breathed their last. And then the impossible happened. Not 3, but 4. Men were walking and talking in the flames. The fire didn't harm them. The king couldn't believe what he saw. These Hebrews, still alive and free, and someone with them who had the appearance of a deity. I do know, however, I do like the king's response. In humility, he says to these three men, verse 28, "Their God delivered his servants who put their trust in him. They violated my command, yielded up their bodies, so they could not be served or worshipped any god except their own God." Do you find that powerful? I do. Do you want to know the biggest lesson that I get from this 3rd chapter of Daniel? Mistreatment often makes the biggest impact. When people turn on you, and yet you still hold your ground. Nebuchadnezzar's interest in God and respect for the God of these men would never have happened without the furnace. The impact was so powerful that the king was speechless, and he had to have his high command at his side to verify that his eyes didn't betray him when he saw life return from those flames. Do you think this story could happen to you? Do you know people still watch you? And they're going to respond to you when you're in the middle of your tribulation. All God wants you to do in the middle of all of that is just trust him. That's all he wants, regardless of the outcome. The Bible doesn't say, but do you think Nebuchadnezzar ordered the army after this fiery furnace experience to go back out there in the plain and take that statue down and go and hide it? We don't know. Do you know, as I've grown older, I find myself gazing all the time at wonders out there in creation. Something that I have discovered, and it belongs to all of you. And it weighs only 3 pounds. And if you picked it up, it just feels like a wet sponge. And I want you to know that you can travel the outer space and look for as far as your eye can see, and you'll never find anything as marvelous and as complex and as high functioning and above all most extraordinary than what I'm going to tell you. Do you know what I'm talking about? I'm talking about your brain. That brain between your ears. That human computer. It's an object of absolute, pure wonder. I'll explain it to you. The consistency of the brain, if you were to analyze it and take it apart, it's a combination of I call it tofu, a little bit of soft butter, and Jell-O pudding. That little instrument, but I also find, is a bit of a paradox. Everything in your world and mine, that little organ has provided my discovery. And it lives down there in silence, down there in darkness. It doesn't have any windows to look out. And it's like a little prisoner down there in its dungeon. But I also read that it doesn't have any pain receptors. It has no painful nerves. Therefore, it has no feelings. But you know what it does have? It has electronic impulses. It's got a steady outpouring of what I'll call Morse code, churning out information, and in 30 seconds, it gives you more information than the Hubble telescope does in 30 years. That little computer of yours sends out information, and scientists call that information exabytes. All it is a measure of capacity. And that's hundreds of times more powerful than the biggest computer that IBM has ever created. In your brain, it only requires 400 calories of energy a day to operate. Do you know how much that is? A blueberry muffin. Your little muffin fires up your brain for 24 hours a day. The fuel in your brain, giving you all that information, are called neurons. And they're a little electrical signal that speaks to one another. David Eagleman, he was a neuroscientist. Here's what he says. Each neuron connects to thousands of other neurons, giving trillions and trillions of connections that are so many connections that in a cubic centimeter, about that much, in a cubic centimeter of your brain tissue, they number as the number of the stars in the Milky Way. That's how many there are. But your brain, like Daniel chapter 3, can be a fiery furnace. For your brain to be completely formed, it takes our first 30 years. A teenage boy, his brain is only 80% formed. A young person not fully wired until his late 20s. In other words, those teenage years, well into adulthood, aren't completely formed yet. And because of that, I teach my teenagers not to drink. No alcohol. That could be your fiery furnace. I don't want you taking any drugs. That can be a furnace too. And if you do, You'll also find that maybe social media can be included. Suicide, especially among young girls, has become a fiery furnace on the brain. Nasty postings on Facebook has destroyed them. Mental illness is another furnace. Bipolar, schizophrenia. Early in life, a patient, he finds that his brain has had a heart attack or maybe a crippling stroke. And what's the result? They live in a fiery furnace all the rest of their life. The leading cause of death among teenagers in their furnace are accidents. They lack experience. They lack life skills. When I counsel these individuals who suffer the flames of their furnace, do you know what I tell them? I take them right back to the old book. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. He still is in control. Mistreatment still leads to deliverance. God never promises us that we're going to be spared of the struggles. But he does say that he'll be with us right in the middle of the furnace. Daniel 3 just showed me that. The Lord used the fire of Nebuchadnezzar's furnace to burn away the cords that bound those 3 men. He uses the heat of diversity and trial to transform us into Christ-likeness. That's James 1 verse 2. Now do you see what I like about the book of Daniel? 2,500 years old, but still as fresh as today's newspaper. Next week, you're going to come back and you're going to learn even more. I'll show you what I mean.